My paper today is going to focus on one particular aspect of these corpus of materials that fall outside of simply texts. And I'm going to be looking at the photographic materials, the photographic traces that we find within the secret police archives. I'm going to present my own categorization of the photographic corpus based on explorations of some KGB files, some Siguranța files and Securitate files from Romania and the Republic of Moldova, all of which relate to Inocentists, the religious group that Igor mentioned earlier. I've chosen to do it this way because I want, rather than choose a single case file and just look at the photographic traces within that, I've chosen a selection of files that show us as full a spread as possible of the different types of photographic image that we find there. What we have are the photographic practices of the communities represented by confiscated images, and the photographic practices of the secret services in their surveillance and crime scene sort of work. So it's basically two bodies, the kind of insider imagery, insider representations, and those produced by the secret services. Of course, these are framed within the case files or network files. So in terms of the materiality of these photographic images, we have to take into account the two different sets of producers and audiences and their relocation into a new context, which is the case file and in the secret police archive. So I'm particularly attentive to the way that images have moved around, sometimes hidden, sometimes revealed in different contexts, and how the different contexts reveal different meanings and allow us access to alternative ways of looking at the truth of particular cases. So I'm going to try and cover a wide selection of images, and it probably will leave you with more questions than answers, but bear in mind it's a preliminary categorization of these images. Doing it this way, looking at both sets of imagery, kind of reinforces Susan Sontag's view of the photographic activity as both a justification and an incrimination. Its possibility to act both to justify a given identity or belief, and to incriminate, to act as evidence against groups. So that's that dual character that's present there. And as I said, I'm particularly attentive to acts of hiding and revealing the image. What happens when the image is revealed after being hidden? What happens to hidden images today that probably could be revealed? So the research is based on time that I spent in the State Security Archives in Romania, also looking at some files in the Republic of Moldova, and my recent experience of just looking at a few case files here in ÁBTL. When we turn to the materiality of the secret police archives, of their material composition, their material nature, Christina Vasilescu has pointed to the idea that actually the secret police archives were never truly secret. She refers to it as a spectacle of secrecy, because actually the intention behind the institution was for people to know that the archive exists and to fear the institution that produces the archive because of the power of the archive over the population. So it's a visible, if you like, spectacle of secrecy that's being performed across East Central Europe. And perhaps the quintessential example of this would be the Romanian film from 1960, Reconstruirea, which was produced collaboratively between filmmakers and the secret services in Romania about a particular case, and indeed some of the criminals acted within the film itself. So this is a way of directly demonstrating to the public, to a public, that the secret police have this omnipotent, omniscient view and are able to utilize this archive in relation to the public sphere. In relation to religious minorities, this kind of public display was used in propaganda, anti-sect and anti-religious propaganda films. And there's an image here from a Moldovan film from 1985 where you can see film footage of Secret Service agents as they enter into a religious community as a way of dramatizing, if you like, the revelation of the hidden religious practice that takes place there. I talk about a kind of palpable atmosphere of drama and intrigue associated with revealing and then hiding materials by the secret services. Obviously, we know that the textual study of the archives is quite advanced. Again, I'm most familiar with the Romanian literature, and there are handbooks, guidebooks published describing how to handle different types of reports and the different roles that different archival documents played in the general state security system. And the materiality of the archives is gradually sort of coming into focus. Sonia Lerman, in her study of Soviet archives, talks about the way that when an archive is put together, it creates strange new configurations that wouldn't have existed otherwise. They only exist in relation to the archive. Sorry, that was Christina Vasilescu. And the complex set of social relations that can be traced through the archive if we look at each aspect of it as a material dimension. Of course, archives change over history. Items can be placed there and they can be removed, and any sort of research in the archive is only ever a snapshot of a particular historical point. The key thing is there that, you know, evidence can be moved, pages can be reorganized, whole files can disappear. So in exploring the materiality of the archive, we enter into not just now time, we have to look at its past and its future orientation, the future orientation of the archive, what's intended and where it's going. So in relation to photographs particularly, one of the kind of ethical concerns that I sort of mulled over for a while was when we move away from the text, when we move away from the intention of the Secret Services in compiling the archive, and we begin to look at visual representations, both of communities and produced by the secret police, where there's a danger of aestheticizing what we find there, being fascinated by the visual, the imagery, and so on, and divorcing then the materiality from the text again. Okay, but I think the truths that we find within the visual materials are still text dependent, so they cannot float away from the text, even though we might like to undo the kind of intent of the secret services. They cannot float away from the text that surrounds them, literally, that they're sort of bound into the same folder or glued into the same folder. And which is why we have to do another kind of epistemological maneuver. We have to separate out the materiality of the image, which we can hold and grasp and remove from the archive, and the visual content of the photograph that we look at. So there are the photograph itself is a material object that has qualities, has meaning, irrespective of what is represented. And the visual data that we read has meanings that relate to its position. So the fact that materially you can move an object means that visually you have to read it differently. So again, it's quite a complex sort of epistemological maneuver we have to do, and that's all in relation to its position within the textual folder. So really, I mean, what I'm getting at here is we have to be aware that material things can move. The drama and the performance of moving them we have to be attentive to, and that not only includes the practices of the secret services, but all religious groups have their own secrecy practices, which are sometimes accentuated when those groups are repressed. And we have practices today that, as academics, but also the public media, that we also selectively reveal and hide different images that are present within the archive. So it's an ongoing dramatic performance, if you like, of hiding and revealing imagery. So as I already mentioned, my paper today is going to deal explicitly with a set of photographs that are of the inner Kentist community, which is why I have this slide here. This is an image of one of their kind of hagiographical narratives. Inner Kentism is a particularly interesting religious group to look at because visuality played a very important role in the genesis of the movement. And because of its origins in orthodoxy, there's a particularly powerful theological factor that lies behind the use of visual images, and it relates to the kind of theology around icons and the way that in orthodoxy, as one sort of scholar of sort of orthodoxy described, there's a culture of seeing into being. So there's an intimate relationship between what exists cosmologically and its representation in visual imagery, and the way that spiritual, let's call it spiritual power, can be transmitted through devotional practice in relation to icons. So inner Kentism, in my view, owes much of its spiritual power to the innovations that took place in visual representation that were made possible by cheaply produced photographic images that could bring into being, through new practices of seeing, a new cosmological order with new divine actors in the world. Okay, so the photography, when thinking about the practices of photography and the secret police, I drew quite heavily actually on another colleague's work from here, from Rolf Muller's publications, which were very, very helpful in categorizing the photographic practices and pointing to the way that photographs that are used as evidence also display the agency of the groups that are represented in the photographic images. So they're the ultimate evidence, but they are also powerful testimony to the justification of religious groups through their own creative practices. So groups can self-represent easily through photographs, perhaps more easily through a photograph than they can textually, especially when print and access to typewriters and so on were very heavily restricted and controlled. Photographic workshops were much more easily accessed, and I think, as Eva pointed to in her own presentation, if you don't have access to the meanings of the visual image, it's difficult for it to be used as evidence against you. So communities in the secret police archives can self-represent, and representations of their religious life can be legitimized in those self-representations. This is my categorization of photographic images, and I'm going to go through it sort of section by section, looking firstly at crime scene photographs. And here's an example from a KGB file that's very early on, actually very kindly supplied by Igor Kashu from Moldova as a quintessential example, and I've been using it ever since because it is such a good example. There's a whole range of photographs, but here we see a selection of photographs that demonstrate how crime scene photography was to be conducted. And Rolf Muller uses the Hungarian criminology handbooks from 1960s. I looked at the Romanian Securitate journal, and the way that the crime scene photographs are described is mirrored exactly in these four photographs. So we have an environment photograph, the general scene, looks at the background, and then moves into how perpetrators might move around the crime scene. And you can see there the ladder there's an image of the ladder. So you have the crime scene and how to move around the crime scene. Then you move into the central photograph, which is the heart of the event, which we have at the top, which is the actual place where secret underground religious rituals were conducted. And finally, detail photographs, what exactly is criminal. In this case, the criminal activity falls into another category because it's a reconstruction photograph of a religious ritual, which is the actual evidence that we're looking for. But you can see how the images move around in this way. Now, these images are particularly useful for the study of underground religious movements because, as far as I'm aware, even though there's been a lot of focus on how religious undergrounds operate, there's been very little focus on the materiality and the spatial dimension of that life world, that new life world that was created by underground life. So the next category I look at is the photographs of of arrested individuals. And again, this example comes from a case file that inspired Igor to publish a short article in the Romanian online newspaper, Adevărul, which, again, Igor kindly sent me the article and then later the file. And in exploring the file, we find two representations. We find this one, which is the mugshot. I think his name's Gheorghe Zgherea. Here he looks pensive, he's devoid of agency, perhaps fearful, his head is shorn, and so on. But the file also contains an image from the community. And there's a stark contrast there between the way the state security have stripped him of aspects of his identity, but the way the state security know that the incriminating nature of the photograph from the religious community can be used as evidence. And here he is. He was an Inokentist leader. He's in a position of honor here. This is a kind of formation that occurs, this kind of photographic form, in numerous files of three individuals together with the important person seated in the middle. And you can see here that Zgherea has two crosses around his neck in typical sort of dress of Inokentists from this period. And the saintly, or the saintly identity of the members of the community is indicated through, especially on the right-hand side, the woman is holding a cross in her right hand, a symbol of martyrdom according to Orthodox iconographic tradition, which was, in this period of time, was actually illegal to represent somebody in such a way in photographs, because it mirrored so closely the practices of icon writers or icon painters. So in this case, with the kind of two options, if you like, for representation, what's important in terms of how the photograph moves is Igor's own editorial sort of decision to publish the image of justification of identity as opposed to the image of criminality that existed before. So it's the potential of the archive to justify or vindicate is also contained within the power of some of the images. There's a very important dimension of files that relates to surveillance operations. I don't really have time to talk about the kind of character and how surveillance was done photographically, but in the absence of surveillance materials, the KGB in this case reverted to or employed the reenactment of religious ritual as a way to demonstrate the criminal activity. And here we see images that were impossible to have been collected by surveillance. They were actually reconstruction images, and they were used by the Secret Service to demonstrate the roles that these individuals played within the community. And later, the link with the public media can be seen in articles that were published in the 1950s. In this case, it's in Tineria Moldovei, so a youth magazine in the Republic of Moldova, against the Inokentist sects. And these are clearly taken from the same photo shoot, the same two individuals, the same costume and so on. That exact photograph is not contained within the file, but I think Dumitru, in exploring the file, has realized that they were engaging in curatorial activity in the file itself. So the file, which ostensibly is a single case file, actually contains photographs from numerous cases, and it was probably prepared for another purpose, which may well have been for use by the media organs in the preparation of news magazine cases. Now we move on to the second major category. So they're all photographs that were produced by the secret police. Now we look at photographs that were confiscated from communities. And this image is a photograph of two of the most important leaders from Inokentism. On the left is Inokenti himself, and on the right, Alexander Kuliak. Here the most important thing is the way that new technologies are being merged with photographic practices, a combination of painted interventions on photographs which were then mass produced, and these were standard images that were found amongst the community that would be kept rather than having to have a big book or a massive icon. The final one, which is probably my most interesting example, comes from a 1960s case file in Romania about the appearance of saints. The case file stretches to about 8,000 pages, but there's one very, very interesting informer's report that is either somebody that infiltrated the group or that was recruited from within the group that describes the biography of a particular photograph within the file. So this is from the informer's report. She told me then, one of the two women that are presented here, that the militia man got hold of a photograph with her, with CA. CA is in the centre. He was the religious leader. He's an ex-monk and priest that led this particular group of Iniquentists. And that if she is asked by the militia if she knows CA, that she won't say no, because the militia have the photograph. But if she is asked about any other brothers in the group, she will say nothing, even if they cut her to pieces. I asked her how the photograph reached the militia, and she told me that she was photographed together with those I mentioned above. Then she sent the photograph to CA through the post, and in this way the militia man, who actually lives next door to one of the members of the group, intercepted the mail, got the photograph, made a copy of it, and placed it back within the secret police archive. And the fascinating thing is, we have the image in the secret, but we have the image's doppelgangers. So we have 3 copies of that image, and they were produced by the state security. So this little vignette, if you like, which fits into a much broader pattern of the surveillance of this religious group, tells us about the power of the photographic image to both incriminate and justify. It invites us to think about the meaning of the photograph in the different contexts, and how the photograph passed from hand to hand, and how the photograph was reproducible in order to demonstrate the practices within the group of spreading the images of themselves with their spiritual father. Okay, so really that's what I wanted to do, present the different forms of photograph that we find, and really to describe the opportunity we have to explore the meanings that accumulate around images through this attention to, like, the spatial and historical and cultural context when images move around in and through the archive. Also, their relationship to their textual milieu that surrounds them. And I'm going to quote, just to finish, an American scholar that works in Siberian archives of indigenous peoples. He highlights the idea that really the photographs are a perversion of the empirical event, in the same way actually that the texts can be seen as a perversion of the empirical event. So we have actually 2 different means of approaching the truth through these 2 different means of perverting their empirical nature. And because qualitatively images are different from texts and they're handled in different ways, they produce, I feel, more holistic understandings of the context, whether it's the historical context or bringing them into the contemporary context, how we are to understand the fascination with, the problems with, the dramas of secret police archives in contemporary society. Thank you.